Thank you, those of you who have joined me. It's always nice to know that you are not totally alone on these things. Okay, and yes, so thank you to a couple of speakers that I've just been listening to, because indeed my presentation is about the practice of English as a medium of instruction around the world, and indeed Thailand and Indonesia are included in this book, which is actually due to come out hopefully maybe next month, just depending, because always at the end there are things that hold the book up, but let's hope we can manage to get this out very soon. Anyway, I think we tried with this book to be as inclusive as possible. I guess always there's someone that maybe may not be included, and apologies for that, sorry. But believe me, we did try. And I will explain as much as I can in the time available what we tried to do. So yes, so the last two speakers that I've been listening to, and here we are. Yeah, I mean, as indeed a native, this is my language, English. Okay, and obviously I speak it. That's what I do. And indeed, when I'm, in my own environments, which is maybe the UK or New Zealand or one of those, well, obviously we speak English. But elsewhere, I mean, people have been protesting, if that's the right word, about the evils of linguistic imperialism. There was Kanagaraja in Sri Lanka, and Philipson, 1992. It's been going on for a while. But in spite of this, and in spite of the fact that I can understand, where they're coming from, honestly, I can, English has continued its inexorable march, the global lingua franca. Why exactly English has become the global lingua franca is another issue, and we don't have time to go into all of that, although it's an interesting debate in its own right. I mean, the fact is that, rightly or wrongly, with current realities, English is the language in which the world does business, interacts socially, travels, entertains itself, and so on and so forth. As indeed in an article with my colleague Adem Surij, we published this in 2018. Sorry, I didn't quite finish that. And of course, I suppose for these reasons, English is increasingly the language in which is used for, educational purposes. And so EMI, this is where EMI fits in. Even in places where, English doesn't even seem to fit, does it? I mean, you can obviously understand why they use EMI in England or the UK, or England in the UK or in the USA or Australia, New Zealand. But, why they would use it in other places, such as the two we've just heard about, Thailand, Indonesia, but of course, including the ones where I am right now, which is a Turkish environment. But they do, and it seems to be, it's not slowing down. Yes, it is. This is Dearden and Julie Dearden and Ernesto Macaro. They've done a lot of writing on this, and this trend is showing no signs of slowing down. Yes. So they typically, sorry, it's just jumping around a wee bit. Maybe I'm not quite used to this version of it, but anyway, yeah. So Ernesto and Julie, typically, they define EMI as being in environments where English is not the common language in the environment, such as, well, I suppose we could say most of the rest of the world, after all. The most salient reasons that they provide are the desire for internationalization and also and to establish a, a global profile. But also there is the economic imperative that, frankly, there's a lot of money involved in this. And people, schools, universities, they want to attract international students and the revenue. So the benefits, well, the major benefit is that students can learn this language at the same time that they're learning their subject. So they don't have to waste time, if that's the right way to put it, learning the language. But hopefully they will absorb the language just as a result of studying their subject, whatever it may be, business or science or maths or whatever else. In other words, it saves time, saves energy, saves money, etc., all those kinds of things. And it sounds like a very good idea, of course. But does it work? That's a question which is actually increasingly being asked. Indeed, I mean, there are challenges, and some of the challenges have been mentioned in the two talks that I've just been listening to. This is Beliha and Elami. The current EMI situation leaves much to be desired, they say, with students struggling to learn the subject matter due to low proficiency in English. I mean, I think honestly that it is often underestimated how difficult it is to learn, to study in a language which is not your own. Students will say, oh, I will work hard, and I'm sure they mean it, but they honestly underestimate just simply how difficult it is to do this. I mean, thinking of my own case, for instance, just as an example, I mean, I have worked in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Indonesia, actually, even itself, and in Turkey. I mean, I could not have taught in any of those places in the local language. I mean, it was just simply impossible for me to do that. And in order to get to a sufficient level where I could competently have taught my subject in their language, it would take, frankly, years. And so I do really think it is underestimated, the sheer difficulty of this job. Bayun et al. In Korea, the difficulty isn't only the students, and this point was made also by my previous speakers. I mean, it's also the teachers, but I mean, the teachers often they are very good in their own subjects, in their science or their maths or whatever it may be. Suddenly, they often, this comes out in the study we did. I mean, they don't choose to teach in English in EMI. They are told by their schools that this is what's expected. And all of a sudden, these people who, as I say, may be very competent in their subject matter, but they suddenly have to teach their subject matter in a language that they are not really proficient in. And why should they be? I mean, I'm not proficient in maths, for heaven's sake, or science. You can't be proficient in everything. I mean, I think that we should be careful that this is not seen as a criticism of teachers, that they are not competent in English. I mean, why should they be? And so on. However, we did sort of think that, the difficulties mightn't apply everywhere. Maybe they're different in different places. And so questions that we asked, why do students and teachers around the world, why do they choose to do it anyway? Or why do they do it? What are the advantages? What are the difficulties? And any recommendations that they might make. Now, these were the areas that we discovered. We sort of split the world up as much as we could into sort of hopefully reasonably sensible areas. There were 11, and they're here. And these are dealt with in the book. But the hypothesis was that we kind of expected to find that there would be differences across the different regions. And so these were this is what we found. These were, the next few slides will show what we found. And Nicola, I'm aware that time is sort of going on. If I'm sort of going on too much, just try and tell me. Okay. Anyway, okay. Is it okay? All right. Okay. As far as the governments and the institutions were concerned, this was what was found across all of these. The ones I'm going to report here are only the ones that were fairly general across regions. There's a lot more in the book, but simply when you have to reduce it to a PowerPoint size, this was pretty much all I had room for. These are the most common, these are all regions. So the desire for internationalization and creating a global profile, which I mentioned before. The desire for international students and the revenue they bring. Desire to increase international mobility. The desire to gain access to academic resources where English is the lingua franca. The desire to enhance intercultural competence. And also the desire to improve domestic students' English proficiency. This was mentioned by quite a few, actually, that they did it so that, you know, the local students, not just international students, but actually also the local students that would rise. And then they would have, you know, these people ready to go into the workforce. So these were the commonly mentioned motivations. By the way, I don't think I mentioned that it was actually, this was actually a meta-study. There was the 11, I'm just going to go back, but then Izet and Kirk, one of my colleagues and my colleague, he was the one who got these ones together, you know, as a summarized at the end. When we come to the teachers, motivations of the teachers, there was actually only one mentioned across all the regions, and that was, as I've already sort of indicated, actually institutional pressure. In other words, they did say that actually most of them actually didn't choose to do it. It was not their choice, but the institution that they worked for, whatever it may be, they said, you know, we need this taught in English and you're going to do it. Yeah, well, yes. How reasonable is that, one might want to ask. Advantages, well, there was a list here. Publishing opportunities, English as the international language, more chances to improve, more access to specialized sources, higher chance of continuing education abroad. This sort of came through fairly strongly. Higher chance of employment, more exposure to English, and the fact that they maybe wanted to immigrate to an English-speaking country, and they thought that this might give them more opportunity to do so. So they were the advantages. Challenges, and there's quite a few, and these were mentioned across all. So linguistic inefficiency, difficulty communicating, lack of vocab, difficulty explaining their content, you know, in a language that they're not familiar with and the students are not familiar with, lack of previous training and practice, diverse student L1 backgrounds, low level English proficiency of the students, lack of learning strategies in English, students' lack of EMI experience. This tended to cause teacher demotivation. Difficulty expressing ideas and in comprehending the materials, lack also of student motivation. So I noticed the decrease in student motivation, both at teacher and the student level. Recommendations, they needed more professional development and support. This came through quite strongly. Need for reference material and study aids. Also, and I think this was mentioned in my previous speakers, the need for bilingual or parallel language instruction. Yes, this was mentioned quite strongly, that it shouldn't be only English, but also, bring in the local language. Problem with that, of course, is that, I don't know, this may vary a bit from environment to environment, but in where I am now, for instance, I mean, it's the local language is Turkish, but not all of our students are Turkish. And therefore, if they're going to be, have bilingual Turkish lessons, well, it's going to leave them struggling. Yeah, the whole situation is not simple, and I think we should not be trying to oversimplify it, in fact. As for the students, I don't know, there sort of seemed to be, a lot of consensus among the teachers. There were a lot that came across, but not quite so much consensus from the students. Actually, there were only two that all of them mentioned. They wanted to have access to study materials, which are mostly in English, and they wanted to find better jobs. And so those two motivations were what drove them. And as for the advantages, there was only one noted by all of them, access to information, which again is very heavily, I've seen figures of 90% mentioned that this kind of information is in English. There were two other advantages, which were improving English and developing intercultural awareness. These were mentioned by 10 of the 11, but not actually quite everybody. Challenges? Well, actually, none of the challenges was reported over all regions, but most, 10 out of the 11, reported feelings of incompetence, difficulty expressing themselves, lack of vocabulary. And of course, then, which has already been mentioned, 9 out of the 11 mentioned teachers' inadequate level of English. And this is also mentioned by both of my the previous two speakers. As, that the actual level of the English is not really adequate in many cases. I mean, not all, of course, but in many cases. Recommendations students made that the use of code switching or translanguaging. And 10 of the 11 subject-specific language training, that they just needed more support, I suppose we might say. And 9 of the 11 recommended study aids and support, and also improved teacher proficiency. That was, so the proficiency thing gets mentioned by from both the teacher's direction and the students. So conclusions, it was hypothesized that considerable differences would be found, but in fact, actually, the differences, there was remarkable consensus, we felt, not identical, of course, but it's still, remarkably similar, that there were so many who said pretty much the same thing. The main motivations for both teachers and students tended to be based on the desire to raise proficiency in the global lingua franca in order to improve academic and international opportunities. And the main advantages were seen as the potential to improve language proficiency at the same time as developing subject competence, which is, of course, the very thing that that EMI is supposed to do. Whether or not it does it, achieves that is, of course, not. But that's the motivation that they see these students and teachers. However, there were considerable challenges, perhaps the main one being the lack of sufficient language proficiency on the part of many students and teachers, leading to low subject competence. And I have seen a British Council report, which was not at all encouraging, suggesting that actually EMI leads to actually lower, it doesn't actually increase the language as much as hoped, but also it doesn't actually give a good grounding in the subject. So almost, yes, it does. It's rather a lose-lose situation in both directions, which is a bit depressing, isn't it? But I think, nevertheless, we need to consider this. Recommendations included addressing the proficiency issue, yes, either by limiting access to EMI courses until a sufficient proficiency level is achieved, and or providing more language tuition and support. A greater acceptance of code switching and parallel or translanguaging was also recommended. So they were the recommendations that were made. However, in spite of these really quite, these are pretty serious challenges, I think. EMI seems to be like an unstoppable train, as Ernesto put it back in 2015. And I think it was in the same article. He also suggested, 2015, it was time to start asking some difficult questions, he said. Now that was 8 years ago. And I think, well, I had previously come to a conclusion just from my own experience, but the results of the, the articles in this book have confirmed that really, I think, I agree with Ernesto. It is time we started asking some really serious questions and addressing the issues involved with EMI. As noted in this book and elsewhere, the demand is huge, but I'm not sure, honestly, that we have addressed the very serious problems involved with EMI. And I do really think it's time we did. I guess that's what I would like to conclude by that thought. There's a few references here, and of course many more in the book. And thank you for your, I hope I haven't gone over time too much. Thank you for your attention. If you would like to email me, that's the best one to get hold of me on, and also my website. Thanks, Nicola.